Hello, everyone, and welcome to the European Studies Center at St. Anthony's College and the CSOC Seminar Series. This is a hybrid event, so I would like to warmly welcome those in the room, but also the online audience. I'm Marilena Anastasopoulou, a lecturer in History at Pembroke College and a research associate at CSOC, and it's a great pleasure to chair today's session titled All Stories in New Ways, using the historical documentary form to revisit national history. And I'm very honored to present our very, very eminent speaker, Professor Stathis Kalyvas, who will discuss the challenges, dilemmas, and choices of transferring abstract documents into a visual form. This talk derives from his unique experience in co-authoring the 7-part TV documentary series titled Disasters and Triumphs about Greece's modern history, which was, if I may add, extremely successfully broadcasted on Greek TV almost a year ago. So we can say that this is an anniversary. Stathis will transfer us behind the scenes, discussing his significant contribution. Stathis Kalyvas is a Gladstone Professor of Government and a Fellow at All Souls College at Oxford. And until 2018, he was the Arnold Wolfers Professor of Political Science at Yale University. So before we start, I would like to briefly share the structure of today's seminar. Stathis' talk will last approximately 45 minutes, and a Q&A session will follow with the audience attending both online and in person. And this seminar is expected to last 1 hour and 45 minutes. So without further ado, and with great excitement and anticipation, Stathis, over to you.
Well, thank you. This is a great pleasure to be sharing the experience of actually making something that I never expected to be making, which is a TV series. It turned out to be a very interesting experience and raising some very interesting issues. So the way I'm going to structure my presentation is discuss the motivation for doing such a thing. I don't want to become a TV star. That's not the reason. Very little theory. I discuss the process. That's the main part. How do you go about it? What are the big choices you face? Present the product and briefly discuss the reception. And then we open up. I can show you some clips from the series. And depending on your questions, we can move in different directions. What is the motivation for doing that? Well, I started becoming interested in the crisis that hit Greece at the moment it started happening. I thought, as a political scientist, I had to pay more attention, not just to what was happening, but also to what was going to follow. At the time, there was a tremendous amount of pessimism about the prospects of Greece. Not just the prospects of Greece, as the cover from The Economist in 2009 suggests, the fears of the crisis spreading across the Eurozone. And the motivation was a series of articles, perceptions, observations, anecdotes, very much along the lines of Roger Cohen, who is a famous, very well-known columnist of the New York Times, who was arguing basically that the history of modern Greece is a series of disasters, a series of catastrophes. And that didn't really resonate with me. Recently, actually a couple of days ago, I was traveling on a plane and I came across this movie that I never heard, which is called I Love Greece. It's a French production. I don't recommend it. It's not a great film. Don't watch it, or watch it if you want be entertained in a different way, but it had a very interesting dialogue, which I managed to capture on my phone, which I think represents this kind of pessimism that I wanted to address. So you have a family of Greeks, and then the daughter lives in France, and her husband is French, and they move to Athens, and they have this conversation. It's true that your country has gone through crisis after crisis: World War II, the Civil War, the dictatorship, and now the economic crisis. It's pretty disastrous without, and then there's a death in the family. So that's the idea that really the history of Greece can only be interpreted as a chain of failures. So that's the idea that I wanted to critically examine. And so I wrote this book in 2014, which came out in 2015, exactly the week when the referendum was proclaimed, the deepest and worst moment of the crisis. It was translated in Greek. And then, even though I thought that the book was going to be completely unnoticed, it did very well this summer after the referendum, the summer of 2015, mostly through word of mouth. So it became a bestseller. It sold a lot. And so one of the ideas that I had after the success of the book, which presented at the worst moment of the Greek crisis, a very positive idea about Greek history that was very much out of sync with what most people had in mind at the time. I had this idea, why don't we try to turn that into a documentary series so that we can use a different form and speak to people who don't read books, basically. That was the idea. And my concern, both with the book and with the documentary, was to try to shift that narrative that I just presented. The first goal was to move away from this overly pessimistic understanding of Greek history as a series of disasters. The second was to do it in a way that was sound, scholarly, that was academically solid, that was based on research, not on just reversing the image. And the third was to do it in a way that was both accessible and attractive. And that's a very big issue because very often academic ideas are not easily translatable, either in terms of words or images. So these were the three goals of that. The challenge was fundamentally how to shift a particular perception of national history, which is ingrained in people's minds, starting from school, essentially, and then does not really change very easily and is endlessly reproduced. And to do it in a way that doesn't really push people away, because people are very attached to national histories. This is part of who they are, it's part of their identity. But at the same time, the stories they've learned are often either incorrect and misleading and deceptive, and also very dysfunctional, because one of the problems with a lot of people's understanding in Greece of Greek history is a celebration of defeats, heroic defeats as opposed to smart victories. So I wanted to switch the gaze, but do it in a way that was successful. Is it possible to have an impact? I cannot really answer that question. I thought at the time it would be nice to run an experiment during the time that the documentary was shown, to actually measure the effect of the treatment, but I didn't have time to do that. So it would be interesting to try to see whether people's attitudes and minds changed. It is not an easy thing to do also because public history is a very difficult field. It's a field of contestation. And public history in the age of social media is even worse. It's where you get dumbing down, you get discord, you get disputes, you get polarization, you get people shouting at each other, you don't get people discussing. Social media is not a medium that allows you to have thoughtful conversations. So public history is difficult. Public history and in the age of social media is doubly challenging. However, the big advantage we had was the crisis, because if there's something that I've learned as a political scientist is that times of crisis open up opportunities. People are open to challenge existing assumptions when the world around them is crumbling. When everything is going well, they feel very safe about their beliefs. It's not a good time to be trying to impact people's views. What do we know about historical documentaries? I've done a little bit of research. It's an enormous field. There is an enormous bibliography, but I'm not going to bore you with that. There is, in fact, a classification of historical documentaries into 5 types. What you have is the standard version, which is the expository documentary. There is a voice of God, there is authority speaking to you, and so you have to believe what you are listening to. There is another form which is very popular called observational, which is a journalistic investigation, following things as they are happening, interviewing actors And that's very connected to the interactive form in which the interviews happen with people who are directly involved with the events that the documentary follows. Then there is a reflexive form. I would say that's the academic documentary, in which it's very meta. You reflect on how a documentary represents reality. And finally, there is the performative documentary, in which the main character, you find that in YouTube, a lot of YouTubers do that, in which the main character is the person who shoots. So it's more about the person than the question. What we ended up producing is a mix of the expository and the performative. And I'm going to discuss that in a moment. The process. So how do you do that? I had this idea in 2015, and I only got to do it in 2021. So it took 6 years to actually pull together all the strings. But before telling you about how we got about doing it, the first challenge is, how do you turn abstract concepts into images? The advantage, the sort of lucky break I got, was the bicentenary of Greece's eruption of the War of Independence. So 2021 was a year in which there were going to be a lot of celebrations. Of course, that was before counting in with the COVID pandemic. But it turns out I was very lucky, because I managed to convince a major television broadcaster to do it. And we actually signed up just a week in February of 2020, just a week or two before the outbreak of the first wave of COVID. Had it not been for that, that would not have happened, because a lot of plans actually collapsed at the time. So I took advantage of that. Oops, sorry. And then the challenge was the translation. And what we came up with, and I can show you examples throughout, was the use of public buildings as visual cues for complex ideas. We took advantage of buildings, most of which were vaguely speaking to the audience, but we used those buildings to make an abstract story come to life by, in a sense, using the building as a representation of the argument. We also used, especially for the first parts of the 7-part documentary, where we do not have moving images from archives, we used art. And we used a lot of archival material, especially for the second part of the 20th century. We worked a lot on selecting that material, and we tried to find material that had never been screened before. It's also very expensive to buy that material and very complicated to do it. So having a good production company helps a lot in identifying and getting this material. But of course, images serve as a backdrop. They're only half of the story. The other half are words. And so the overarching question that essentially I wanted to address is, what is modern Greece? The standard answer is the modern version of ancient Greece. Or to put it in a different way, the modern version of Greece. Because when you use the term Greece to a non-Greek audience, and very often to the Greeks themselves, it's ancient Greece that comes to the forefront. And there were 3 ingredients in this process. I wanted to decouple the modern experience from the ancient experience, which is a very challenging thing, because in a sense, it's very difficult for people to think of those 2 entities as being separate in time. The second was to introduce a take that was optimistic, but also realistic, realistically optimistic, if I may put it. And the third one was to insert social science, to insert concepts that are not necessarily present in historical accounts, at least not in abstract ways, things like polarization, state building, modernization, economic development. So even though it's a historical documentary, it's very much infused by social science and by the kinds of issues that I have researched in my academic life. I wanted to avoid cliches. I hate cliches. I don't want to repeat things that people already know, to revisit trodden paths. But I also wanted to avoid provoking people. Because if you provoke people on these kinds of questions, they turn away. So how do you do that is a matter of fine balancing. So structure mattered a lot, and this is where my training in social science actually helped me a lot, because one of the things that I've learned in my research is to structure arguments. And so there is a sort of underlying, almost I would say, sort of civil engineering dimension to it. There are 7 episodes, because the argument, in a sense, disaggregates modern Greek history into 7 cycles. And these, of course, are metaphors, but also based on signposts. And every part was disaggregated into 4 distinct parts that follow a similar logic, which I'm going to describe to you. So the basic idea is we start every part with a major disaster. So this is to basically shock people and also to conform to their expectation of Greece's history as a chain of disasters. So we, in a sense, we appropriate the argument of the disaster and we showcase it, and we start with that. But then what we do is we try to explain the origins of that disaster, and so we flash back into the process that led to that disaster, which very often has in its origin a major plan that went badly. So we describe that plan in the flashback, and that's the second part of every episode. Then we show how that plan actually went badly, which is something that's not very often discussed. People say, well, the plan was bad, and that's why it failed. But we actually show the process through which you start from something that's quite ambitious, and then you end up with a disaster, a failure in your hands. And lastly, we basically have the redemption, which is, in most Hollywood stories, is, in a sense, getting success from the jaws of defeat. And this is what saves the day and provides this kind of optimistic perception. Because eventually, those disasters are not the end of the story. They're the beginning of another story. So that's the fundamental structure, which actually worked very nicely, I thought. Just that. Yes, and so my inspiration was this documentary, which is, if you've seen a Netflix documentary called The Last Dance, is based on the history of how the Chicago Bulls won, I think, 7 or 8 NBA titles. I don't remember the exact number, but they used this kind of flashback, going from the last season, the initial one, and then reconstructing the story in a way that they found extremely attractive. So I was able to convince the producers and the directors that that was going to work. And my argument was The Last Dance. If it was just, me telling them that, it wouldn't have worked. But I had an example. And if you haven't seen The Last Dance, it's a masterpiece. You should. Even if you don't like basketball. It's really about human ambition, essentially. So essentially, this is the story of 7 big projects, 7 big disasters, and 7 big rebounds, which collectively and sequentially produce the Greece of today. That's the story. This is what Greece is, right? The first one is the story of the War of Independence, how the War of Independence gets defeated, and how eventually, in spite of that military defeat, the insurgents get what they're looking for, which is an independent state. So that's the first episode. It's very much, it corresponded very nicely to the Greek War of Independence. It was shown in 2021. COVID produced a delay. I'm going to discuss that, but at the same time, it came very nicely on the heels of various celebrations. By providing a very different image, there is very little in that episode of the actual war. It's all about what precedes it and how this war ends up transforming a defeat into a victory. The kinds of things that people don't get taught very much at schools, and the kinds of issues that are not very much discussed in public history. So it's almost like a mirror image of the conventional official history of the Greek War of Independence. The second episode is all about state and nation building. Now, when you say nation building, to people who have been schooled in the idea that the nation is invariable and constant throughout centuries, that has to be presented in a very skillful way. And so that's the story of the second episode. It's basically this, perception that once you win independence, everything else is going to follow. But in reality, nothing follows. Greece becomes, starts its life as a failed state. And then the question is to explain how it goes from failed state to an effective, a real state. The third one is about what every state in 19th century Europe was trying to achieve, that is to expand its territory. So it's a story of the main sort of idea that dominated Greek imagination in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the so-called great idea, the idea that Greece should expand to encompass all Greek populations, which ends up with a tragic disaster, the so-called Asia Minor catastrophe, which we celebrate today, this year, we celebrate its 100th anniversary. But what is the success? The successful integration of over 1 million refugees, which is a story that was much less commonly told, much less commonly known. So the emphasis of that part is on integration as opposed to the military defeat and the massive displacement of Anatolian Greeks. Fourth episode is the story of political and economic modernization. It's a story that is not very often told. In the interwar years, it turns out, Greece experiments with various ways to modernize politically, to create new institutions. This is a story that only academic historians know well. The public does not really know very much about. It's a story that ends badly with a civil war. We don't go into the details of the Civil War, but we discuss it. And we connect the Civil War of the 1940s to that, which is known as the National Schism, which starts in the mid-1910s. And then the success is, in fact, the reconstruction after the war, post-Civil War history of Greece. The fifth episode is about economic modernization. How do you create a modern society? And in fact, this is when Greece escapes from underdevelopment, but it ends very badly with the military coup of 1967. So economic modernization is not followed by political modernization. So there is a mismatch. But then the success is how this dictatorship eventually gives way in a very interesting way to a transition of democracy, which is the beginning, in fact, of the third wave of democratization. The sixth episode is about democratization. So you create a democracy, but how does it consolidate itself? There is a very big challenge in Greece in the 1980s, and that's the challenge of populism. And we show how populism challenges that process, but eventually reinforces it. So that's very consistent with a recent discussion about so-called how democracies die, where we show that in the case of Greece, and I believe more generally so, populism is not only a challenge to democracy, but also a challenge to which democracy gets reinforced. And finally, the seventh episode is incomplete, right? Because the big disaster is the Eurozone crisis. We show how, Greece got there through its big ambitious plan to integrate into Europe. And of course, it's open-ended. So the ending is used in order to summarize the entire argument, very much like a scholarly book, which is the conclusion where you summarize the entire argument from the beginning. So the structure is very tight. I spent a lot of time working on it, and I'm going to describe how I did that. First of all, I had the book. So the fundamental ideas, the research was done in the book, which actually facilitated the process because I only had to translate an argument, a book, into a script rather than write a script from scratch. So I had a lot of work behind me, which made a very big difference. I was also very lucky to be matched with a very good production company. We had a very good collaboration. We also had disagreements on various issues, but it was an intellectually challenging and fertile project in which we were able to communicate and collaborate very successfully. I learned a ton of things. And there was a key decision from very early on that this was not going to be a voice of authority type of documentary, but it was going to be my personal quest. And so it was going to be presented both as a serious attempt to understand and interpret and describe the history of Greece, but also at the same time as something that's very personal, which its main implication was that as a result of that, I had to front the interview, which is not an obvious decision. It's not always the case that the person who provides the sort of book is also the person who fronts the series. But it turned out to, in fact, allow us to combine the idea of an authoritative voice with the idea of a personal quest at the same time. And in fact, one of the directorial decisions that managed to sort of convey this idea of quest is are the plans in which I'm shown to be walking from place to place. So walking is the sort of link, the visual link that translates the abstract idea of a quest, right? So it's a blend of an expository and a performative, and there is also some interactive in the sense that I bring in a lot of experts. I bring in fact, in interviews, the people on whose work my book was based, because I didn't do the primary historical research. I depended on historical research that was done by primarily historians, but not just historians, also political scientists, sociologists, economists, and journalists. So it's a very varied group of people. We try to bring people who were not commonly or very, we had some very well-known people, but also a lot of younger and less well-known people as well. So the mix, I thought, was quite nice. I wrote the script in the summer of the pandemic year of 2020. And then we decided to start shooting, even though the pandemic was not over, which was a very interesting experience. There were challenges and opportunities. The challenges was that we couldn't, for example, get access in many places we wanted to shoot because the owners or the authorities wouldn't give us access. We had to do interviews in the pre-vaccination period. So there was a risk there. But there were opportunities. We were able to produce plans in a sort of empty Athens because we were told we should not show people wearing masks. Otherwise, the series would be dated. And so you'd see plans in which Athens, central Athens, is empty, which would have been totally impossible to produce during a normal time. For me, the biggest disappointment was that I missed the process of shooting a film or a documentary is very collaborative, very collective. You travel with your team, you sleep in a hotel, you eat together. Physically, it's a very exhausting type of job. You basically have to stand all day. You spend an entire day producing just a minute of footage, for example. And at the end of the day, you really want to enjoy yourself with your team. You feel part of the same family. You want to drink and eat in a nice place. We couldn't do that. There were no restaurants. There was nowhere to go. There was a lockdown. We had special permission to be out. And we had to eat on our own. Terrible food delivered by the places that deliver food in our rooms. It was miserable. It was not, ideal, unfortunately. We did a lot of location hunting. We did 40 interviews. I think about it. Every interview had to be prepared. People were dropping out. People were dropping in. We had to personally manage every person. There was a lot of work on selecting the archives, editing, the music, the narration. I learned how to do the voiceover on my own. Lots of new skills, and then finalizing the entire thing. So it was a full-time job. I basically didn't do anything else for 1 year. So if it weren't for the pandemic, I wouldn't have been able to. I had this idea that I would do it on a part-time basis, traveling between Oxford and Greece. Without the pandemic, it would have been incredibly difficult to do. So it was a blessing in disguise, in a sense. The product, as I said, we have the 7 episodes, and I'm happy to show you various parts in the discussion session and the Q&A area. I can show you perhaps at the end, just the beginning, for those of you who haven't seen it. There are some very interesting key underlying stories for every episode. So the first one is really, how did the idea of Greece as a nation state came about? Something that's considered automatic or fully understandable. We actually look into that. How was state and nation building achieved? What were the contradictions of nationalism in an era of imperial disaggregation? A very interesting story in the fourth episode is the fact that in the interwar years, basically Greece experiments with the three big systems: democratic capitalism, fascism, and communism. Something that is not broadly more generally known. The story of the great escape from underdevelopment, which is a common story to most developed countries, is a story that in Greece is not really well known. How Greece achieved modernization in the political sphere, and also the question of, how do you trade sovereignty for economic and political integration into the European system. So there are broader stories out of every episode, and lots also of smaller stories as well. The reception. It went very well. We reached between 400,000 to, the top was 1.3 million, but these are people who just, zap for just 1 minute, or more. So we don't really know whether they actually have watched that. It was shown, there was a sort of second showing after midnight, which did surprisingly well, capturing a younger audience. And a lot of people also watched it online, especially outside Greece. So it did very well. It did also very well for a documentary. It was shown on prime time, which was a very big risk because it was competing against some of the most popular television series. So people were very happy in terms of its performance. The critical reception was also, on the whole, very good. But the real surprise for me was no backlash. I mean, I've been involved in various public disputes about history, for example, the history of Civil War. There was nothing sort of the same magnitude that I've experienced in the past, which is strange because when, in a sense, you are reframing a national history, you expect a backlash. So why didn't we see that? Because I think I was an equal opportunity offender. I offended everyone, and as a result, there was no coalition of people offended. So there was not a uniform kind of front that creates this kind of backlash. So what did I do? Who did I offend and how? Well, the first two episodes, I basically offended the far right because I'm telling a story that challenges, the basic principles of nationalism. The next two, I offend the far left because I deal with questions of, civil war, communism, the Communist Party, etc. The sixth episode, I offended the fans of the Socialist Party, and the final episode, I offended the fans of the center right, which basically led to the crisis of 2010. I'll show you. I mean, the far guys are much more vocal, and so, for example, that's an example. First, this is a sort of newspaper of the far right, history for traitors. And, my version of history is the history of traitors. But, people didn't pay too much attention to that. Yes. And these are some of the left-wing critiques, basically doing the pitch of the international capitalism and the dark forces. So overall, I was very happy with the reception. And still to this day, a lot of people, when they see me in the street or elsewhere, they tell me, how they liked it, how they were surprised they didn't expect to hear something new. So it's very rewarding to have such a reception. And I'm going to close with the next steps. What I would really like to do, among other things, is of course an English version, which is not just a matter of subtitling, it's a matter of changing the narrative and adapting it to an international audience. I think there are 30 million people who come to Greece every summer, roughly. Even if a fraction of them wants to know or wants to learn something about modern Greece, because very few people know anything about modern Greece, there is nothing for them. They have to read books, which very few people do these days. And so I think it would be great to provide them with a history of modern Greece, which I think is very interesting for a variety of ways. So I would really like to do that, but it's not just up to me. And I would like to do more projects. I think I just, got the taste of it. It's a great experience. It's a very interesting and very challenging intellectually and mentally way. I like popularization. A lot of academics think the popularization, should not be done by serious researchers. I don't agree with that. I believe great researchers have to be and must be great teachers and must also be great popularizers. Doesn't mean that everyone can do it, and there is a division of labor for good reasons. But if you feel that you can double into all of that, I think it makes sense. And especially for me, having done all this research in my life, I feel that I've learned a lot, and I'd like to share a lot of that in ways that are not just intellectually appealing, but also aesthetically pleasing and also challenging. I mean, the idea of translation in different forms, I find that very exciting. I can show you perhaps just the beginning of the series. You probably have seen that, but so should I share the screen now? Okay. So where's the yes? Okay. So this is the the beginning is here. We start with the crisis. The entire series begin with the crisis of 2010. I'm not translating, but you can get the gist. And this is the connection with past. The crisis of 2010, the War of Independence, and use the famous painting by Delacroix, the disaster of Chios. And then there is an overview of the various disasters. Oxford. This is questioning the narrative of disasters and presenting the project, presenting that quest. And you see the walk-in, which is going to be sort of trademark. That's one of the few speaking to the camera. This plan took like one day, an entire day. Here, it basically provides the counter number. The idea that those disasters are matched with success. It's not the story of going down, it's the story of going up. And of course, up you have the clouds and mountains. This is shot with a drone in Peloponnese. Then again, matching art with shots. Another day, under tremendous heat. Working. It's the southernmost part of the Peloponnese. So these are the questions, puzzles, the answer. empty. No one. In fact, the police wanted to arrest us. Okay. So that's it. And I'm happy to answer questions, to tell you more. Feel free to shoot.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
So I just wanted to ask a quick question. Is it possible to see your documentary in this country?
You can, it's on YouTube. I mean, you have to search for it, but it's not subtitled in English.
Oh, okay.
Not yet, at least. So we don't have an English version yet. But as I said, I would like to produce one in the near future. Yes.
Thanks, Dr.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Stathis. This was an extremely interesting, excellent, and highly engaging talk. And I think that disasters and triumphs actually offered a very multi-directional and multi-leveled and also very interdisciplinary understanding of Greece's modern history. And I truly enjoy the navigation in terms of different sources, from archival sources to visual sources, as well as geographies from Oxford to Athens to Kavala and different places. We will now open the Q&A session. I have the intention to collect a few questions. Hopefully we will manage to run a few rounds. I saw a few hands. So let's start with David, Jonathan, and then Kia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting. Stathis, can I ask you one aspect though? I mean, obviously, the main things you use are the visual images, which are so powerful, including you plodding around, which is super. But you had a title there, music. Tell me about how you use music, because obviously music is another fantastic way of telling a story. So how did you find the music and use the music?
Well, I didn't find it myself. There were two directors. One director who had the general overview of the project, was also the editor and also the person who selected music and had, so as I said, the overview. And then there was a director who was actually doing the shooting. The music was the choice of the first one, Yuri Averov is his name, and he did what most directors do these days. He relied on existing music banks and selected the music. It's pretty amazing, actually. You can find everything you want. Yeah. And it was his decision and his choice. Of course, we discussed various choices, but that was his responsibility, and I think he did a pretty good choice of music. Yes.
Yeah.
Jonathan, would you like to?
Yeah. I was intrigued by your comment about public history, and does Greece have many public historians? I was led to this by having heard a lecture towards the end of last year by Michael Wood, who has been a public historian for many years, and in fact is, I think, now a professor of public history at the University of Manchester. I mean, is there a tradition of public history in Greece, or is it more something which, in a sense, you're inventing?
No, there is no tradition of public history as a separate field, but there is a small selection. There is a small group of academic historians who also speak to the broader public. And traditionally, the history of Greece was also a public enterprise. The most famous of the early historians of Greece, Konstantinos Paparigopoulos, who sets up the framework that still is used to make sense of Greece in Greece, was also someone who was writing to a broader public, not just academics. And then you have also, of course, some very well-known historians, people like Mark Mazauer at Columbia University, who is writing books that are highly academic, but also very accessible to the public. So he wrote a book about the Greek War of Independence that came out a couple of years ago or a year ago. And he, in a sense, is moving between, a generalist audience, especially in Greece, but also outside Greece, and a more specialized academic audience. So there is always an interface. And so I think that's a very healthy kind of situation, because the people who do public history very successfully often are very good researchers themselves. And so you can trust that what they're presenting is not just a repetition of other things, but is the result of research.
And in broadcasting as well?
Broadcasting is much less common. Traditionally, you've had, I don't think there's been a sort of general documentary about modern Greece of that sort, but there have been some approximations of that, but they've been produced by journalists primarily, with using historians as advisors. But I don't think we've had that model in which the researcher plays such a central role in the production of a TV series like that. It's much more common, for example, in the UK, so people like Simon Chama and others, less common in other countries, like France. In the United States, some of the best documentaries have been produced by on Civil War, jazz, by highly specialized producers of historical documentaries rather than academic researchers. So you have different models.
Yeah, do you like to continue?
Yes, thank you very much, Stathis, for the talk. I thought it was really interesting to hear about the process of popularizing academic research. And I think we hear a lot about impact, etc., in our daily existence in the UK universities, but I very rarely see kind of a project of this type and of this ambition in terms of popularizing academic research. So I think it's very interesting to hear how you did it. I wanted to ask two short questions about the substance. So the first one is, if you could remind us of some examples of factors that have helped Greece reach kind of the triumph stage or kind of rebound from disasters and progress over time. So what are some of the structural characteristics of the country? And the second one is, you said in your talk, and you've also written about this in the past and provided many examples, that Greece in some kind of processes like democratization, like nation building, like populism, was at the forefront of those processes. And I'm wondering, is there a reason for that? Is it something that is random? Do all countries are at the front of something? And if Greece is particularly frequently at the forefront, then why is that?
The two questions are connected.
Yeah.
So the idea that for some reason Greece very often gets associated with global processes is surprising, because Greece is an incredibly small country. I was finishing my book. I was visiting in 2014 the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. In terms of Sao Paulo, as a city, is bigger than Greece in terms of population. So that gives you a sense of the scale of things. Now, Mark Mazauer was one of the people who made this observation that Greece very often engages on issues that acquire a global dimension. So the Eurozone crisis, for example. There's no reason that a crisis that would hit Greece would acquire such significance if its crisis was not challenging the entire European economic integration process, right? So why is that Greece and global process get together? So the argument here is that I made in my book was that for historical reasons, Greece is a very early late modernizer. So if you have the first wave of modernization, which is represented by core countries, and then you've got the post-colonial world, so to speak. Well, Greece sits at the intersection of the two. It's one of the earliest new nations states in Europe. It's a state that tries to escape from the periphery and join the center, to modernize. And therefore, the kind of challenges it stumbles upon tend to be very new. If you take the story of the Asia Minor disaster, is the first instance of institutionalized population transfer, which is going to become a common issue in post-colonial environments in Africa and Asia. following the Second World War. So we see democratization, modernization. We see a lot of the things that are happening in post-colonial countries. We see them happening very early on in Greece. And in fact, I have an example here, which I can show, if I can share my screen again, which is from the second episode. Difficulties of having, where's the share screen? Yes. Okay, it's got to work. Okay. So the second episode, we introduce the viewers to the question of state building. And the way I do it is by producing a very provocative and challenging comparison, which is the following one. It's here. I compare, we drive across Greece. The concept of failed state is exclusively associated with the post-colonial. And yet you can actually transpose it, use it to make sense of Greek history, and at the same time show how these things are not exclusive. They're matters of historical periodization, cycles of development, rather than of cultural characteristics very often. So we basically zoom out the picture of Greece as a scorched kind of country. And then I compare Greece to Somalia and Afghanistan. That was how Greece started. So the question becomes how that has Greece managed to transition from a stage of absence of institutions into a situation in which new westernized institutions, which have nothing to do with traditional ones, have been created and built from cloud, and often by foreigners, not Greek, right? And these are the kinds of things because of an early mover advantage that places Greece at the forefront. So that's a comparison. I cannot tell you how many times I had to drive while speaking next to a incredibly sort of precipice. This is Mali, so we did very nice. So that's the point. But have a very sad story. So this was local fiefdom. Here is a political economy, fragmented sovereignty, tendency of various local chieftains to tax goods that enter. So you didn't have a unified. It's a very complex argument presented in a very simple way. By the way, this is almost like he just died. Yes. A very well-known historian. Stop sharing. Okay.
Well, before we continue with the Q&A session, as a part of the Q&A session and as an active chair, I also have 3 questions. So the first one is about the challenge of communicating a nuanced understanding of history to multiple audiences and the particularities of the Greek case. So public history can be seen as a process of, as you said, translation, mediation, and popularization. And Disasters and Triumphs TV documentary series are structured around 7 episodes, or the 7 different circles of Greece's modern history, beginning with 1821 and ending with the contemporary economic crisis pretty much until today.
Yeah, we actually start in 1740.
Exactly. What are the challenges of narrating 200 years of history through the pattern of disasters and triumphs?
I think it's not a challenge, it's actually an advantage. There are signposts. If you don't have signposts, you cannot narrate anything. So you need anchors to base, and again, these are the kinds of things that I learned by writing papers and books. So you do learn something in academic research.
And another question about the particularities of the Greek case. How public history is applied or constructed varies a lot from society to society. So based on your experience, on your recent experience, what are the particularities of the Greek case?
I don't think I've read a number of general histories. I'm quite familiar with the history of France or of Italy. And so I was very inspired by various works. When I was writing my book, I wanted to see how others have done it for other countries. And so I was very inspired by works that I read at the time. In terms of documentaries, I cannot say that there was a model. I watched the Simon Schama documentaries. I didn't like them very much. I thought they were quite pompous. He was, sort of speaking a lot in front of the camera. They were a bit slow, a bit boring. So I think what we did was, if I may say so, more modern in a way. So obviously, for someone who only watches YouTube, it's kind of slow. So I'm sure there are other ways to do it, but I didn't really have something of a model. And I think even though the production team were very experienced in doing this kind of work, they also pushed the boundaries. The guy who did the shooting, the director of the shooting, is a very young guy, Alexandros Merkouris, and I really think he had very fresh ideas. For example, if you look at the interviews, they're never framed in the traditional way in which you are at the center of the image. I cannot go back now, but you see, in a sense, people showing up on the corners. It's a very unusual way to shoot. And I think that contributed very much to presenting something that was unexpected. People didn't expect to see, a different story shot in a different way. I think that was, in a way, what made it attractive.
Second question, about collective memories and identities, as well as about national self-awareness. Referring to the 2015 Greek bailout referendum, you wrote, and I quote here, "No one likes to remember that horrible time, but it's also necessary stage in the healing process." So memory and silence, remembering and forgetting, form our understanding, historical consciousness and interpretation about past events. All nations have their scars, their unheroic or inglorious past, their difficult heritage, or in Kalyvas' terms, their disasters. But they also have their triumphs, as you emphasize. So in the process of shaping collective memories and identities, to what extent is it important to come to terms with traumatic memories?
You don't want to silence bad moments. And obviously, as I said, because that took place in a time of very almost a national depression and high pessimism. People were openly, in fact, they were overshooting in terms of traumatic pasts. They were only emphasizing that. And so that was not difficult to do. But the thing is not to dwell only on that, is also to provide a redemptive story. And I think redemption is the key word here. So the key element of this narrative is the story of redemption.
Yeah, that's a very interesting element. And my last and more reflective, potentially question. So we have Disasters and Triumphs as a book and Disaster and Triumphs as a TV documentary series.
Well, video game is next.
Maybe. So while converting the book into a documentary, into a TV documentary, did you learn anything unexpected that reinformed your understanding about Greece's modern history? And on a more reflective note, if you had to revisit the book, would you change anything and why?
Well, the second one is a difficult question. Let me try the first one.
Mm-hmm.
When I was doing the interviews, I had a very strange sense of deja vu because I was interviewing people who were basically telling me what I wanted to hear. And I'm like, why are they saying what I want to hear? And of course, they were saying what I wanted to hear because I had relied on the research to write the book. So in a sense, I had internalized their arguments, and then I was listening to them, telling them to me back. So it's a very interesting story of back and forth. What would they change in the book? I'm not sure. I don't know. I've thought about bringing it up to date because the book stopped in 2015 for the Greek edition. I'm not sure what I would change. I could certainly add a lot of material, but I'm not sure that it's something that would be useful. Another thing that I've been asked to do is the University of Crete has a very successful program of online courses. So perhaps I will do an online course on modern Greek history. I'm sure there are a lot of other puzzles that I don't touch upon. There is a term that a lot of academics don't like, which is storytelling. Storytelling in political science is very often used as an insight. But I think, to be able to convey and communicate things, you have to be able to tell stories. I think that's the essence. And of course, I want the stories to be, I wouldn't say real or objective, because I don't necessarily believe in that, but based on serious research, so credible. And I want stories to be interesting. And to be interesting, they have to start with a puzzle. There has to be sort of anticipation about the result or the solution has to be non-obvious. And that's how you take viewers and readers with you. They want to know the answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's begin with the second round of questions. Would you like to start?
Thank you very much. It was absolutely fascinating. I have a question and then a suggestion of CSOCs to consider. The question observation, like many people in this room, I studied classical Greek and Greece. I was lucky in that we were also taught about modern Greece, even modern Greek. That was the advantage of not being taught at Oxford for this part. To what extent do you think that this sense of disaster, and well, I'll put it directly, the perception that modern Greeks have fallen from the classical ideals, never mind that is completely exaggerated and false even, to what extent have these attitudes survived and maybe subtly have influenced the response of the international institutions, not least in Germany, to how Greece should be treated in the Euro crisis? I would contrast the treatment of Ireland, which was more, say, well disposed. The suggestion just for CSOCs to consider is, since my modern Greek is pretty poor now, why don't CSOCs take some excerpts, and some of our colleagues could then provide a running commentary so that we could access.
Well, to answer the second question, it's a complicated issue that has to do with rights. And so there are many actors, the TV broadcaster paid for it. And so it's a complicated story, but as I said, that's my intention, is to find a way to produce an English or an international version of it. And I'm pretty insistent. Since I managed to do that, I think I can manage to do the next step. In terms of the first question, I discussed that in the book. The connection of modern Greece to ancient Greece is a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, the Greeks had used the symbolic capital of their connection to an ancient civilization as part of the process in which they've been able to win a lot of external support, which explains the redemption, the movement from disaster to success. At the same time, however, they've been seen by foreigners often as imposters who take advantage of that connection in order to sell themselves as something they are not. And they're often, this imposter syndrome affects modern Greeks. Because when you compare yourself to one of the biggest civilizations, you're always going to fall short. And that has facilitated the process of a process of self-understanding that is based on failure. And so I think part of my project is to present modern Greek history as something that is interesting, valuable, and good in and of itself, irrespective of any connection to the ancient past, which is very difficult to do because history in Greece in schools is taught in a linear way, going back to the past. And so everything becomes infused, and there is almost a sort of implicit bias that influences people in which they see modernity as being a footnote to antiquity, something that can never measure up. I jokingly compare Greece to people who are children of famous actors or famous writers who never managed to rise up to their parents. And so you're always unhappy. And I don't think that's very healthy. So that's one of the ideas here.
I have a question about the English version, the hopeful one, the English version, and how the language will affect both form and content. So do you plan to remain on the same narrative form and structure, given the new possibilities the English version creates? And are there any big stories that you want to follow, which, again, the English allows you to follow, which you couldn't do in the Greek version?
Well, one idea is to try to do the minimal amount of change, because otherwise it becomes very complicated. You have to do something from scratch. If you don't want to do something from scratch, the easy solution is to subtitle the interviews, which are self-contained and self-explanatory, and change the voiceover. Because the voiceover right now, the narration speaks to Greeks and assumes a number of things that an international audience wouldn't necessarily know. And that would be easy to do because the space exists, and also because the original version of the book was in fact written for an international audience, not for a Greek one. And one would have to change, the beginning perhaps and the end to adapt to a different audience. But I think these would be minimal changes that could be done for not a very high budget. One has to buy the rights for the archival material, the footage, etc. We only bought them from Greece. I mean, there are a number of complications of that kind, but with the right team, you can do it at a very high cost. But to do something that's fundamentally different, you have to do something from scratch, I think.
Which is not the plan.
Which perhaps could be a different project, but not this one.
I know that there are a few hands, but let's now give the floor to our online participants. Ladislav, would you like to ask?
Can you take a question in the meantime?
Absolutely. Othan, would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Marilena. Now, I have first to say that it's very admirable what you did. We see the outcome, but we don't understand sometimes, the whole energy and your personal will that you put into this project, because, this is really congratulations for having done this. It's innovative. It's a different way of looking at history in Greek television. Definitely, I can testify to this, because one of the most boring things, in the Greek television were the documentaries about Greek history, having that voice. What did you call it at the beginning?
The voice of God.
The voice of God, with some photographs or whatever. So I just have to congratulate you on this to begin with, because it is a massive undertaking. And I've got 2 or 3 questions, if I may, to ask you. The first one is very much on the substance, right? So when you consider Greece, do you see Greece as an exceptional case? You did mention the prototype, but what I would like to know is whether you see it as a case which can be comparable with other parts of the semi-periphery in the world with those common features. And is this model also of project disaster and triumph a model that applies to other countries as well, or is it something which is uniquely, to the Greek case? And one which is related to this sub-question is, how do you choose the project, and how do you also choose what the disaster is? Because, the project, are pretty convincing, but the disaster actually you could have chosen, for instance, the 1897 disaster, which was the defeat from
yeah, that
was another disaster point.
And that was the disaster used in the second episode.
But how do you kind of choose, your selection? How does this take place? So these are the points of my substance, and then I've got a couple of liberation.
Okay. Greece is sort of very similar to other, both semi-peripheral and peripheral countries, just earlier. That's the only exception I see. It's the timing. I don't think the nature of the project is different. And what sets Greece apart besides the timing is also the access to the symbolic capital of Greek antiquity, which makes the Greek case very appealing to other audiences. But besides that, I don't think there's anything exceptional. The stories of Greece are the same challenges: modernization, state building, nation building. These are general concepts that apply to every society and every polity. In terms of the choice of the signposts, I would say for the most, the disasters there is consensus about them. So I basically picked the major ones, perhaps with one exception, the very big crisis of the late 80s, early 90s, which is not really perceived as a major disaster, has been forgotten. So you have to balance areas on which there's consensus and also take some risks, make some choices. But you can tell the stories of other countries using that kind of idea. In fact, now that you're suggesting, I should patent it and sell it to historians across the world. You can have a disaster and triumph version of every country. I'm sure you can. I mean, it's a good idea. We have to find a lawyer to do that.
I mean, I would challenge your disaster, the populism that you mentioned in the 1980s as a disaster point.
Well, it turns out that 1989, 1990, Greece almost went to the IMF, which came very close to having a financial crisis of very large proportions. In fact, it got a loan from the European Commission, the EEC at the time. It was bailed out, but without conditionality. But the situation was very dire, and I was reading some of the writings lately after I wrote the book and I did the series by a person who played a very key role in that period, Zolotas. It was not. It was. We underestimate how close Greece came to a disaster. Now, of course, there are counterfactuals in history. If Greece had collapsed the way it collapsed later in 89, 90, perhaps it would have avoided the later collapse. So there is a sequence, there are connections. But as I said, the idea of disasters and triumphs is not meant to be a deterministic kind of scheme. It's meant to be a set of metaphorical signposts which are connected with real events, but allow us the sense to narrate and tell a story in a more interesting and a more intriguing way.
Yeah, and you did preempt me a little bit, because that was going to be my point of criticism, actually, that it becomes a bit deterministic if you take this pattern, and in the sense that then you need to fit various developments as projects, disasters, and triumphs, with probably not necessarily being, or maybe not of the same magnitude, as the others. But my other point that I wanted to ask you is whether how did historians, I mean, you did speak about party political reactions, but how did historians view this kind of initiative?
Very positively. In fact, the majority of the people I collaborated with, whom I interview, with whom I have discussed, the major historians of modern Greece. So they were part of the project in a sense. It wouldn't be possible. It would have been impossible to do such a project without the active collaboration of the community of historians. Now, obviously, not every historian would agree with every interpretation, and some of them would actually disagree. But in general, there was no pushback from historians. The pushback came primarily from journalists and partisans, but not academics this time.
Thank you.
Let's move to our online question.
Yes, if I can. I'll allow David Blackman to talk. He's online right now, and he would like to mention a few comments.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
That's good. Thank you. That was fascinating. I look for Marilena must help us to look at the original version of this film. I wanted to raise the question with two memories of the survival of memories of evil times. I was a young man on the British excavation of Mycenae, a wonderful experience. And because I was learning Greek fast, I helped with payday and personnel. And I was warned, be careful, you must not put this family and that family in the same trench with a shovel. 1960, and coming in, we didn't know that there'd been a civil war in the northern Peloponnese, for example. And again, after I boycotted Greece under the junta, came back up to 74. I remember walking down the street outside the Vouli with a Greek friend, a politician who'd been imprisoned, and he suddenly stopped and shivered and said, "There's my torturer walking by." Now, this is the background to one of my questions. Had these memories now passed? But I had two specific questions. One, November the 17th. I was director of the British School at the time of November 17, and I was a target. The school was the target. We were a soft target. We didn't have a military guard, unlike the embassy. It was quite an experience. Secondly, maybe for your next film, China. The penetration of China, its control of the Piraeus. This is going to have major implications outside Greece, but I hope maybe you'll be looking at that. If not, it was too late for your present film, but I hope for the next one that will come in. But I hope, I'll be interested to know if you've talked about November 17 in these films, which I look forward to seeing.
Yes, it's I think episode 5. There is, in fact, we did one interview within the Polytechnic School to discuss the Polytechnic uprising. And in fact, it turns out I've studied extensively the civil war in the Argolid. That's a major research project. So I know everything about the villages around Messina to an incredible amount of detail. So those memories existed and sort of linger on, but the descendants of the people I interviewed back in 2000 do not really have a sort of a good understanding and knowledge of what happened during those years. They have, it's like this sound exists, but the content has been degraded, which I think probably is for the better, and certainly for the grandchildren and the grandchildren of that generation. I think there's very little interest in the events of the 1940s as they affected their families and communities. They have a very vague recollection, very vague stories to the extent they have. I'm not going to say much about the Piraeus port because it's an issue I do not know well. But we try to tackle questions of political economy, not necessarily those ones in the last two parts. But thank you for your question and for sharing your memories with us.
I think can I just say it's good for you to have an English version so that people coming to Greece are more sensitized than they were already. I didn't gather whether you meant what you said about November 17 and similar groups. Have you mentioned them?
Excuse me, I'm not sure I understood I heard the question clearly. It's about the Polytechnic School uprising, whether we cover that.
The November 17.
The terrorist group.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a reference to that. In fact, it's part of the crisis of the late 1980s, early 1990s. There was a sense of that the Greeks, the Greek state could not police or, couldn't fight against the terrorist group. So it was part of a general sense of crisis that became part of what I sort of signpost for the history of the 1980s. So it's episode, I think, 6, if I remember correctly.
I look forward to seeing it. We were on a specific personal target.
I see. Yes, because was it Colonel Sanders who had been a target of the group?
Thank you very much. And let's continue with the Renee is there. She wants to with the question. Brilliant. The gentleman on the back, and then.
I'd like to thank you for your presentation and for not offending me. I'm part of the political spectrum. I wouldn't tell you which part, and I wouldn't tell you why it didn't offend me. Now, you may link it up with the observational question that's coming up now. This is a visual feast. It's imagination running wild. And as an architect, as well as various other things, I'm not a historian. I saw a frustrated art historian and architectural historian. I think that the balance between the seduction of the image, we're talking about John Berger, William, Benjamin, or whatever, so many other people we can get into, but I don't want to because I know very little about the theory. It's passing on very strongly an image. And I wonder if you really are interested in architecture, which you must, or if you wanted to be an art historian, which may well be, or if you've been in touch with architecture departments. For example, it's avant-garde teaching architecture at Harvard, architecture department, the graduate school, the LSE, the urbanism department. Cambridge have been teaching film in architecture. And it's a very beautiful way of explaining to young architects or would-be architects about their special relationships. Now, the other thing which I noticed, and forgive me, I don't know much about films or anything, is that you put things in juxtaposition. Is it because you wanted to, apart from the obvious thing, is it because you wanted to enrich the imagination of the audience, to start drawing their own conclusions as well? I cannot quite sort of articulate it, but you obviously know.
I actually do not. That was, again, a decision of the director, to use this kind of mirroring, to split image, which I was very puzzled when he did, because I had never seen that device being used before. It turns out to be one of the most successful things we did, but I cannot put my finger on why exactly, and on what he had in his mind. I think it was certainly to enrich, so there was an aesthetic dimension to it, but I never expected it to work so well. So I don't know. I thought initially it was more like a gimmick. I didn't think, but then a lot of people have mentioned that, so it really did a very big impression. It's good that you asked me, because I can go back to him and ask him about that. In fact, I'm giving a master class in the Thessaloniki Festival of Documentary, which is taking place in about 10 days. So I'll certainly discuss that and ask people there and figure out what it means by talking to specialists and experts. On the architecture front, you're absolutely right. I was getting a lot of advice from friends who are architects. I also am quite passionate about it. But also a very important aspect is the other director, the person who did the shootings, Anastasopoulou, is a trained architect. So that explains his ability to produce a frame that is very, indeed, that conveys this kind of architectural vision, if you want. And they're beautifully, especially the drone images, for example. When we want to convey the idea of successful state building, we did shoot the famous trilogia, the Academy of Athens, the university, and the library at the center of Athens from above, and you see a very different image which conveys this kind of monumental aspect. We also had a discussion. I had a very nice discussion with an art historian, Marilena on the history of the design of Athens. We forget, people think that Athens is an ancient city. It's a totally modern city designed from scratch, and it was a state building project, very similar, say, to Brasilia or to a number of design, Canberra, Australia, for example. So there is this dimension as well. And I think, as I said initially, using the built environment to convey these kinds of stories was very effective. But I never thought that it would be actually turned on its head and be used as a way to train architects as well. I think that's a great idea.
Would you like to
yeah, sure. I noticed at the beginning you were seeking to draw the positive trend with the documentary. Was wondering whether you found, when thinking about the cycles, whether there was also some kind of a trend in the cycles themselves, and finally whether you were tempted to speculate about the finishing the 7th cycle and how you would and what you would speculate.
Well, we know now that again, Greece avoided the worst disaster, which would have been Brexit and the collapse of state institutions in 2015. So we know the outcome, and so I think we have exited the crisis, and now the question is whether there's going to be a new big project which is going to lead us to the next cycle. But I don't want to be deterministic in terms of the logic. I think I wouldn't quantify that because I don't think it follows, such a thing. If there is, again, to go back to the question that Kira asked, I think if there is one pattern, is that Greece latches on very early and very ambitiously on big international projects, and that creates risk. And this risk materializes, but it materializes in a way that's under control. And as a result, Greece eventually gets the best out of it. Now, why is Greece latching on these international projects? I think that has to do with leadership. There is also a sort of old tradition, in a sense, you can say, and that goes back to one of the first scenes of the movie, in which you see the southernmost end of the Peloponnese, which is the southernmost end of the Balkans. Greece is trying to escape its geography by, in a sense, trading an insecure geographic position for closer links with the European core. So its chances and its fate is very closely attached to Europe. So if Europe does well, Greece is going to do well eventually. If Europe does badly, Greece is going to do badly. So I think there's a very close connection in that respect. And the fact that many Greek leaders have been very much oriented towards that idea of basically taking the country out of its geographic position and moving it from the periphery to the center, I think that is the driving force and explains disasters because of the risk, but also the redemption because the projects are actually good, they're sound, even if they are risky.
Adrian?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. One of the things you said, so my question's about translating from a book to something visual. One of the things you said really resonated with me, amused me in a way, in a bad way, that the images can be very expensive. And I'm an economist who has been involved peripherally in a couple of documentaries. And there was always a struggle in going from the written word to the expensive image, where one was tempted to latch onto the image and tell the story that accommodated the image that we had to have. Oh, that's a really great image, or we have to use this, or we don't have another one, or it's cheap. Was there any instance where you felt that the story was being distorted by the images that were available, that the subtleties of the book were being eroded by by the fact that you can't have all of the images that you need to translate the book?
It's a very good question. In fact, initially I thought that the 19th century part would be extremely difficult to do because we don't have moving images. So how do you do it? It turns out, like many other aspects, like the pandemic, that was a blessing in disguise because it allowed us to use art, and the whole thing of how Greece manages to get independence is built around the naval battle of Navarino, and so we use the painting that actually we might show that because that's in English, so you can see something in English. We use and it was stored in the facilities of the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So we were there to shoot that. And so being forced to rely on art proved to be an extreme advantage that I never imagined would be so effective. So are we sharing?
Yeah.
Yes. So let's share a screen. And so that is in English. So be able to. Okay, so that was something, I mean, it was part of the production team. They knew about it, about that facility, they found out about it, they knew about the waiting, and so it was, we were able to build the entire story of the resolution of the War of Independence. around that scene. So it was an example of how you, the absence of moving images of archival footage forces you to find solutions that eventually turn out to be even better. So that I think, and the fact that it was in the warehouse, initially we thought that's not a good idea, but then the warehouse turns out to be this fantastically architectural place. And then we get this incredible shot of, the sliding painting. So trade-offs very often lead you to creative solutions.
Any final questions before we conclude today's talk?
I can make one question. So do you think that if somebody wants to do the same documentary in 200 years, because this was done 200 years from the liberation of Greece, do you think it will be again full of cycles of disasters and triumphs, or maybe we can see a documentary of only triumphs, or maybe even
that would be extremely boring. Nobody likes, reversals are part of what makes life interesting. Success wouldn't exist or wouldn't be appreciated if there were no failures. These things go together. So I cannot guess what will be the situation. Who knows? 200 years is a very long time. But my sense is that part of the human experience is the movement from different equilibria, so to speak. That's the movement is what makes things interesting and gives meaning to things often. So I hope there is movement. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a story to tell.
Brilliant. It could be said that this was the 1-year anniversary of the TV documentary series.
So I'm expecting the cake. Where is the cake?
The cake is upstairs, actually. We're very grateful that you revealed the secret sauce of using TV documentary form to revisit national history. And 3 lessons from, if I'm not wrong, episode 7, without big goals, there are no big successes. Disasters are not inevitable. And if we experience a disaster, it's not just the end, there's always a new beginning. So on this very optimistic and positive note, this seminar is coming to an end. And I would like to thank all of you for a very engaging discussion.
Perhaps we can show a final scene, which is the connection of the Asian, disaster, Asia Minor disaster,
and the
so how how to manage precisely that, and then we can end with that point. So, I think it's been shared, no? So it's here. Yes. No, it's been shared now. Yeah. So it's how you go from disaster. So it's the transition moment. So this is the you experience burning. So what we did here was use music for the transition. So it's not just the images themselves, but it's also the use of music that achieves that moment of transition. So these are the tricks of the trade. So thank you very much for coming here today, and for those of us who followed us online.
Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in our next events. And before we conclude, profuse thanks are due, first of all, to our brilliant speaker. So join me in congratulating Professor Stathis Kalyvas. Please join us for drinks in the common room.
Shall I